flu is on the move. The virus has arrived in yet another province.
They're concerned about any health problem that's on the mainland. It's not going to stay there.
Showing the vaccine only thought to be 10% effective.
Nationwide, there are already more than 41,000 cases confirmed. Every state in the country reporting widespread flu activity.
As of this morning, 18 countries around the world have reported cases of the flu within their borders.
Numbers out of Australia as of mid-October are concerning. If you get sick, stay home.
The Persian Empire by John W. Lee. If you're following along with all the history books that I've been getting, specifically the Great Courses, then you'll have noticed that in the Egypt course, there is a little bit of detail with the Persian Empire, seeing as how that the Persian Empire did conquer Egypt, and then later Alexander the Great conquered Persia, and then as a result absorbed Egypt. And then obviously again the Romans conquered Greece and then again absorbed Egypt. And all that was covered basically in the Egyptian courses that I had listened to a few weeks back. But I kind of breezed over it because the Egyptian Empire, there's a lot of time that passed between the very, very beginning pharaohs all the way up to when the Romans finally conquered it and then basically absorbed it. And then you have the whole business with Cleopatra and Caesar and so on. And so the Persians are kind of set in there. And by Egyptian standards, the Persian Empire was kind of a flash in the pan. So as this course goes, it covers about, I'm going to say, 200 years of history, something like that. And so by the Egyptian standards, they're kind of a flash in the pan. And they basically outlasted them. Granted, Egyptian culture was kind of on its way out after the Persians took it over. And they hated the Persians, by the way, until Alexander the Great came along. And the Egyptians basically saw Alexander the Great as kind of a hero who had kicked out the Persians who, like I said, the Egyptians didn't like, thus freeing them from their oppressive overlords. But I really liked the Egyptian course that I listened to. The problem was that he only had so much time and he had a lot of history to cover. So the Persian Empire almost seemed as though they were kind of like a bump on the way to get to Alexander the Great. Plus, from the Egyptian perspective, the Persians kind of come across as kind of a villain. And like I said, kind of passed over quickly. So I ended up getting the Persian Empire as well, even though it was kind of already technically covered in the history of Egypt. So just keep that in mind if you are following the history books that I've been posting. There will be a little bit repeated, but you're going to get from a different perspective, the Persian side of things. And as before with the Egyptian course, there is going to be a lot of biblical references, seeing as how they do have a fairly large presence in the Bible. Specifically, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the book of Esther also takes place in the Persian court, which is actually one of the rare glimpses of kind of the goings-on inside of the royal court. And one thing I like about this course is that he does go through his various lists of references from the beginning of the book and kind of questions the credibility, how we know we can trust them, and gets the viewpoint of those specific sources before carrying on with his outline of the Persian Empire. Again, like I said, going back so far, a lot of different historical figures kind of make the Persians sound almost like villains. And after Alexander the Great kind of crushed them, well, I'm a believer in the saying that history is written by the victors, especially having listened to this course, because the Persians had a pretty vast empire, and with those, the bigger you get, it kind of almost gets a little bit delicate, as it's kind of covered in this course. For example, religious freedom. You couldn't be a big empire like that and control so many people and be a tyrant. You had to be a little bit lax with your viewpoints. As long as people gave their tribute, or taxes in other words, you were basically left alone to worship whoever you wanted, and as a result, for example, in the Bible accounts, the Jews, for example, were allowed to return to their homeland. And again, that all has to do with the tolerance of the Persian court. As long as they got their tribute, they were fine. That being said, if anyone got out of line, they were quick to make an example of them. Namely, the Greeks were constantly instigators with the Persians. They'd be fine for a while, then the Persians would have to go show them who's boss. And a lot of that's covered in this course, and probably the most famous one would be the Battle of Marathon, where the Greeks met them there, and the Persians really wanted to make an example of the Greeks, because if you have one uprising and they're allowed to fester, then other parts of your empire will fail also, because they see the Greeks are not listening to the Persians, so someone else is going to uprise, and next thing you know, your empire is falling apart. So Persia sent a massive army to deal with the Greeks, and lost, which is why you have that soldier who dropped his gear, ran all the way back to Greece, which is the 26.2 miles, hence the marathon distance, and yelled victory, and then died, supposedly. And that's kind of all covered in this course, and that's kind of the beginning of the end for the Persian Empire. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the events of the Book of Esther are kind of around that same time period. So when the Jews are kind of, the one guy says, oh, they're uprising, then the king basically hands his signet ring and he says, take care of them, kill them all, I cannot have another uprising. It makes more sense now. I could be wrong about the timing, but I think it's around the same time period. So by listening to all these courses, you get kind of a historical context of what's going around at different points. Like, for example, with Egypt, what was going on in Persia, with the Greeks kind of uprising. And these empires, even though they appeared pretty stable, they were pretty brittle things and delicate. And the tiniest upset could bring the whole thing crashing down. Now, the course isn't all just focused on wars and battles and who beat up who got ticked off, and then went and conquered someone else, and so on. That can get a little bit boring. He actually goes into a lot of detail on the common people in Persia, their daily life, what it was like. Now, if you're living somewhere in the outskirts of the Persian Empire and then the Greeks conquer you, like say, for example, Alexander the Great comes in, that old thing happens. What was it like for the people on the outskirts? Well, basically, it was just the address changed and where you sent your taxes. That was basically the only change. So it wasn't really a big deal to the vast majority of Persians. And the Persians were responsible for a lot of infrastructure in the area. For example, roads. They had a vast highway system all through the Persian Empire, which assisted in trade, different ideas would spread. Kind of a nice place to live in by ancient standards. So the palaces, by example, too, were also a mix mash of different architecture from different areas, because they would bring those workers back and have just a mix of different styles all through the palace that were very recognizable. So when they had guests, they would see all the different areas basically that the Persians controlled by the art that was displayed throughout the palace. Just another little quick detail is it also goes into, for example, the life of like your average woman in Persia. Now, you may be surprised to find out that the average Persian woman was probably far better off than the Greek counterpart. In Greece, they were kind of more considered property, whereas in Persia, they had a little bit more rights, could own property, buy and sell, invest, things like that, things that the Greek women had no prayer of ever doing. But that's also something that the Egyptian course covered, and I still think if you're going to be a woman in ancient times, you wanted to be Egyptian. For example, there were no queens of Persia that ruled as a queen without a king. But in Egypt, there was queens, and I think there was even a female king. Now, you have to listen to the course to find out how that worked, but it did happen in Egypt. Nothing like that was going to happen in Persia, and definitely not Greece. I don't think it's a waste of time to listen to Persia, even though it's covered with the Egyptian course. It sheds a little bit more light, and you get a different perspective of that time period. So again, going from here, I am going to move on to the great courses, Greece, even though, like I said before, it was kind of brushed upon with the Egyptian course. In an effort to be thorough, I think I'm going to go ahead and buy the Greek one and the Roman course for the next two. And again, with these professors that give these courses, where were these guys when I was in high school? I would have gotten awesome grades. The way they deliver it so smoothly and organized, I would have got outstanding grades had the teachers been this good at the school that I went to, but they weren't, and I didn't, and here we are. Let me know if you guys listened to it in the comments below what you thought of it, and I'll talk to you next time.